The wind swept down from the black ridge with a kind of hunger that made the bones ache. The sort of cold that reminded the land it belonged to winter more than to people. The lantern hanging on the porch of the tiny cabin struggled to keep its flame steady, flickering weakly as if it feared the night might swallow it whole. The poor young girl who lived alone in that battered cabin had long grown used to nights like this. Survival in such places depended on endurance, not comfort, and she had learned that lesson younger than most. Even so, she felt a ripple of concern when she spotted two shapes emerging from the dimming horizon. A tall rider and a smaller figure slumped in front of him approached the fence line slowly, the horse's hooves dragging with fatigue. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to keep out the cold. Her hands trembled from more than the wind as she waited for the strangers to come close enough to see clearly. Asterisk. When they stopped a few yards from her porch, she saw that the smaller figure was a boy no older than 8 or 9, his small body trembling against the man holding him steady. The man himself sat tall and weary, his shoulders squared against the cold, but visibly exhausted from hours on the trail. His face was shadowed, rugged with dust, and days without proper rest. She watched his horse lower its head, steam rising from its nostrils, the animal near collapse. The man looked at her eyes steady despite his tiredness, and he asked, in the gentlest tone he could manage, if she could spare a place for one night. He said they would be gone before sunrise, so that they only needed warmth for the boy and a bit of shelter from the bitter wind. Asterisk, she felt a tug deep inside. The familiar pull of compassion she could never quite silence, no matter how little she had. Out here on the edge of the frontier, kindness was the soul's last defense against the harshness of life, and she had always chosen to give it freely. She hesitated only for a breath, then pushed open her door wider. She stepped aside, signaling them to enter without needing to speak. The warmth inside her cabin was modest, coming from a small fire that hardly reached the corners of the single room, but the man let out a sigh of relief when he stepped in, as if the place were a grand lodge rather than a patched-up shack with crooked walls. The boy slid from his arms and curled up on the old rug near the hearth, his small hands reaching instinctively toward the fire. She hurried to add another log to keep the flames alive, glancing back at the man as she did. His eyes scanned her home quietly, not with judgment, but with a deep understanding of scarcity. He noticed the cracks in the walls stuffed with rags, the mismatched furniture, the tiny cupboard door hanging crooked on a single hinge. He saw the chipped plates, the dented tin cup, the broom made of dried reeds she had gathered from the creek. Asterisk, but he said nothing. Instead, he knelt beside his son, pulling off his own coat and wrapping it around the boy's trembling body. His movements were gentle, every gesture filled with the steady patience of a man who knew how to comfort without causing worry. She watched them with a quiet ache blooming in her chest. It was not envy, but recognition. Men out here often softened only when no one was looking. Yet this one carried a tenderness that seemed to sit naturally on him, as if protecting the boy was not a burden, but a purpose. Asterisk. She moved to the small counter and began to prepare what food she could. Her supplies were meager, nearly gone with winter's stubborn grip refusing to loosen. But she scraped together enough potatoes, herbs, and thin broth to make a simple stew. She offered it apologetically, embarrassed at how thin and plain it was, compared to what most folks considered a meal. Yet the cowboy accepted it with a grateful nod, as though she had placed a grand feast before him. The boy ate with slow caution at first, but soon his hunger overcame hesitation, and he finished every drop. She passed him her own portion with a smile, pretending she was not hungry herself. She busied her hands with stirring and cleaning so neither of them would notice. But the father did. He lifted his gaze and met hers, and the understanding there made her chest tighten. He saw everything she tried to hide, every quiet sacrifice, every worn-out corner of her home and her life. Asterisk night settled deeper around the cabin, and the wind rattled the shutters with restless fingers. She offered the man and his son the bed, insisting that she would take the chair by the fire. The cowboy objected at first, but she simply shook her head and gestured toward the sleeping boy, whose breathing had already smoothed into the peaceful rhythm of deep rest. Knowing it was the only way his son would be warm enough, he accepted her offer reluctantly. She insisted it was nothing, that guests came first, though in truth she rarely had any. Loneliness had become so normal she barely noticed it anymore, aside from moments like this, when someone filled the quiet space. The cowboy sat next to the fire for a long time instead of lying down. He stared into the flames, the glow lighting the rugged lines of his face, softening some and deepening others. There was a weight on his shoulders she could sense, but did not understand. A heaviness that was not just from exhaustion or hunger. It was something older, deeper, shaped by burdens he had carried alone for too long. She did not ask him about it. She knew better than to pry into the troubles of strangers. People out here shared help freely, but stories rarely. Unless their hearts trusted the ground beneath them. Eventually. He murmured that she was braver than most folks he had known, and kinder than all of them, speaking in tones soft enough that the sleeping child would not wake. She only smiled faintly, unsure how to respond. She had never thought of her actions as brave. She simply did what she could with the little she had, the way her mother had taught her before the fever took her. Life had shaped her into someone who gave without thinking twice, someone who believed that goodness must survive even in places where hardship tried to choke it out. Hours passed. The fire dimmed. She drifted into restless sleep in her chair, leaning back with the shawl pulled over her shoulders. She dreamed lightly, but even in sleep she felt the presence of the two strangers. The warmth of shared space reminding her of nights long ago when her family was still whole. It was a bittersweet feeling, one she had not tasted in years. Before dawn fully touched the sky, the creak of the cabin door woke her. She sat up quickly, heart thumping, and saw the man and his son already outside, their horse saddled and ready. Frost clung to the grass and to the cowboy's coat. The boy waved at her with a shy but bright smile. She stepped barefoot onto the cold porch, surprised that they were leaving so soon. The cowboy walked toward her, his breath fogging in the frigid air. He reached into his coat and pressed a folded paper into her hand. He did not explain. He simply held her gaze for a moment, eyes deep with something she could not name, respect, gratitude, and an unspoken promise she could not decipher. He tipped his hat lightly, then mounted the horse with his son and started down the frost-covered trail. Their silhouettes grew smaller until the rising sun swallowed them. She stood in the cold, puzzled, clutching the folded paper. Only when they disappeared over the ridge did she open it. Her breath caught, and the world lurched beneath her feet. It was a bank draft, an amount so large she could barely comprehend its value. Enough to rebuild her home, buy new land, start a life far beyond struggling for each meal. Below the sum was a signature she recognized immediately from rumors, newspapers, and whispered stories that traveled through every town within 100 miles. A name belonging to one of the wealthiest men in the territory. A man believed to own half the cattle and copper that kept the region alive. The cowboy she had sheltered was no ordinary traveler, and she realized, heart-pounding, that she had offered kindness to a man who needed it more than she could have imagined. A man who, despite all his wealth, had looked at her humble life with a softness she would never forget.